Hello, I'm Anna Clark, founder of Heirloom Digital, a history preservation and storytelling company. I'm thrilled to have a conversation today with a true expert in storytelling, Associate Professor Mario Gonzalez-Fuentes of Trinity University. Thank you, Mario, for being here.
Thank you for having me here, Anna.
Absolutely. I am a huge fan of your research. The vastness of the field is exciting. I mean, just to see you trace it from the beginning of human history, how storytelling is so essential to us in terms of identity and passing wisdom from one generation to the next, which is the area in which my company focuses, but also the emphasis for marketers today on getting brands in the minds of consumers and even creating more sales and engagement, some really tangible outcomes. So I thought we'd dive into your research today and all of your experience and see what we can learn together. Sound good?
That's great. Yeah.
Good. Well, why don't you start? I'm curious. I mean, with how huge of a discipline marketing is as a function and area of academic study, how did you decide on storytelling as your focus?
You know, I love this question because nobody has asked me this before. So how much time do you have?
We have a while.
Yeah. Well, look, I'll start with the short answer is that this research focus has been brewing for almost 35 years. I guess the long answer would say when I was very young, like 9 or 10, as part of my extracurricular activities, I joined this theater club ran by a couple. Elvia was a teacher and a former actress, and Cesar, her husband, was a prolific writer of scripts for children plays. He was a playwright. And you know, on each Saturday we would learn the craft of theater performance. And at the end of the school year, we would have this 2-week mini season in which we would present to the audience, to audiences, right? Every day, you know, our play that we had been rehearsing for the last couple of months. And each play that we would present was always one of Cesar's creations. Each play that he wrote had a moral or a life lesson, if you want. Sometimes it would be sort of like, don't be afraid to speak your mind. Or other times it would be constancy and diligence pay off, right? But you know, this lesson or moral was not, as we say nowadays, too on the nose, right? It was subtle, almost hidden in the script. The play's characters sometimes were animals, sometimes were vegetables on a farm, sometimes it would be pirates, right? But no matter what the setting was, there was always a lesson applicable, right, to kids' lives. The process of getting a play on stage, right, to get it ready to be on stage, we'll always kick off with, you know, a couple of sessions in which we would gather around to read the script. Each, you know, one of us playing our part. At the end of these sessions, my teachers, Cesar and Elvia, would ask us what the moral of the story was. We would take turns to guess. And once we had, you know, established and got it right, what the moral was, both of them, Cesar and Elvia, would then say to us every time, well, now remember that moral when you're on stage. And boy, did that help us in our performance. When kids from the audience would come and talk to us at the end of the play, you could tell by their emotions and what they were sharing that they understood the lesson to the letter. So that was a big, almost like meta lesson for me. Storytelling was a highly effective communication form. Not only effective, but persuasive. Years later, when for my dissertation, for my doctorate, I was studying how consumers sometimes use certain purchases or possessions to convey who they are, like their identities. I was fascinated by the remarkably similar stories and story arcs that the people I interviewed used to explain this. And this is regardless of the culture or the country of origin that they were from. So this was to me an aha moment, if you want to say, that brought me back to that lesson when I was a kid. You could say it was almost a full circle story for me.
Oh, this is so exciting. I mean, what I'm hearing is it's like it's this very old world discipline that is rooted in, I mean, really perennial lessons and wisdom, but is applicable today for these very, concrete things. But I mean, I think the scary thing about that though is sometimes we lose the real meaning of this by just focusing on ways to leverage it for some kind of more narrow aim. So I like that we're at least starting out with these sort of big ideas. And even what you're talking about makes me think of the great wisdom traditions like the Bible, I mean, or all of our great religions, these wonderful narratives that have shaped who we are and how we believe.
Absolutely. Absolutely. There is research that has found how religion has or impacts later on how we tell ourselves stories about ourselves and how we understand our lives based on, maybe the main characters that we have in our religion, whether it's Catholic, Christian, Muslim, etc. Right?
Absolutely. I mean, there's so many multicultural themes as well. Let me silence my phone for a minute. Yeah, and then another thing that kind of just occurs to me, Mario, when you're talking is, persuasion, like the power of persuasion and how the great orators of the ancient world, in their rhetoric, they were just absolutely expert at this. Are some of those sort of devices still at play in the way storytelling is done today?
Absolutely. Just as you said it in your introduction, right? In the interview, as a form of communication, stories have been with us for since ancient times, right? To inform, to inspire, to teach, to pass on common lessons across generations, right? They've been with us forever. I mean, since caveman or cave paintings to smartphones, nowadays. Right, so we're consuming stories, either from a wall, 1,000 years ago to a screen in front of us. All civilizations have told stories. I guess if you think about it, they're almost part of our DNA. And there's a lot of research that I reviewed in some of my research too that that shows you that stories and the way that we tell stories have evolved throughout the years to ensure our survival. There's a big current of research that says that stories are basically the way that we cope with survival. And by survival skills doesn't mean just like eating or hunting or staying alive, but it could be emotional survival, right? It could be psychological survival. And so we tell stories in order to keep living and understand and cope with the realities of society. I would argue that storytelling, more precisely, is the oldest form of communication. Think about it. Stories have been given rise to huge industries. The news industry, books, Broadway musicals, Hollywood, Bollywood.
I'm hearing that there are, it's been very effective, throughout the ages. Like, could you unpack for us a little bit, like what makes a story effective? How is this good storytelling done?
Right. So one of the things that I mentioned, with my story, of my childhood was figuring out really quickly, very, early in my life that stories, and I think this is something that everybody has realized, everybody that studies storytelling has realized that stories for the most part have lessons, right? They have, when everything is said and done, and no matter the setting, whether it's pirates, like I said, or animals, or England in the 17th century or whatever, there's always an idea, a corollary, if we want to use more formal words, that everybody understands, no matter whether you're from 18th century, from the 21st century, no matter, whether you're not an animal or a vegetable in the farm, right? I always tell my students, and clients that I've worked with, stories are more, than the form in which they're presented to the audience. That's like the magic of story, right? Be it a book, a movie, or even a song, right? Arguably, or a news report. They're universal ideas that with the potential to transform the cultural landscape. Stories encapsulate information, knowledge, context, emotion. I think Daniel Pink said, Stories are context embedded on emotions, if I'm quoting him right. In this sense, the stories are kind of a high concept, right? They're more idea driven, and they achieve this by using analogies, emotional involvement of the audience. These things are as vehicles to deliver these insights. In education per se, when I apply storytelling to my teaching, to my pedagogical method, I always am very careful to tell people, listen, storytelling does not substitute analytical thinking. I'm not saying that using storytelling, then you can forget about analysis of data and reports or marketing research, things like that. It actually complements and empowers the students to think about different perspectives. Because the stories are all about that, right? When, as an audience, when we hear stories around a fire, or when we hear in a documentary and we hear the, we are looking at the typical documentary. When you hear different accounts, you're listening to different stories about the same theme. And brands do this really, good brands do this really successfully. They show you different stories about how to use the same product, but from different people. So you're listening to different stories about the same theme, and we learn unique perspectives and points of view. And so from an education point of view, the big pedagogical question that I always ponder when I apply storytelling is, how do I make my students produce content with an audience in mind? That is, content that engages. And the reason why I believe this is an important question and challenge for educators and for brands in particular is because engaging your audience, or having your audience in mind when producing, work that is sort of complex and has a lot of ideas and a lot of work behind, exposes the creators to multiple points of view, and this ultimately builds empathy, right, and understanding for others. So I think, stories have been with us for a long time and have been applied to marketing and, education and this and that, because at the end of the day, we all want to be part of a shared history. Mm-hmm. Storytelling is a way in which we connect with each other. I have a sticker in my office. I can't show it because I'm not in my office right now, but I have a sticker in my office that says, the shortest distance between two people is a story.
More memorable, absolutely. I tend to work with people who have ideas that are very, very rational, and they'll come to me and look for ways to make it less dry or more engaging, more interesting. And I often try to tell them, well, weave in different perspectives or in some of the other things kind of that you're alluding to, but not necessarily sharing a formula for a good story. So if you have, an example or a way of unpacking that for us so that we can actually understand, what are the steps that create a very well-crafted story? And that could be from a brand perspective or anything in your marketing domain, would be fascinating.
Right. Yeah, no, that's a great question. Storytelling cookbooks abound, right? Like there's a lot of people are writing storytelling books, cookbooks, and they will tell you, about the 12 steps and the 4 steps and the 3 steps and whatever. I don't see them as steps. I see them as elements. Every successful story that I've come across, both in, movies, etc., in the entertainment world, but also in the marketing world, very good storytelling leverages 3 key elements. Number 1, conflict or change. Number 2, tension. And number 3, involvement or engagement. So the first of these elements, change or conflict. Listen, all stories, every story is about change. Either the protagonist goes towards change or change comes towards the protagonist, right? I mean, next time, watch The Godfather, 1, 2, 3, Jaws, Die Hard, whatever. It's change comes to the protagonist goes towards change. Most of them fall in the archetype of the hero's journey.
Yeah.
And right, how versed we are with the hero's journey and people are watching us. but it'll just say, the hero's journey, something happens in the life of the protagonist that pushes them to embark on a journey or adventure, on a quest, right? Either to solve a problem or to respond to an antagonistic, like an opposite force, right? The protagonist learns something, maybe about themselves, maybe about the world or society, something that changes the way they see things. They come back full circle or almost, a changed person. They may be in the same place where they started, but they're different. They are changed. Besides the hero's journey, there are a lot of other archetypes of stories, but long story short, they're all about change, right? And that's life, right? We humans are constantly changing, and you know it in your company and with the products and services that you offer. We are, growing, maturing, progressing, falling, getting up again, failing, and finally succeeding, getting promoted, changing careers, graduating, retiring. You get the picture, right? Why wouldn't we love stories? They reflect what I call the ultimate oxymoron, that the only constant in life is change. Right? But good stories, when we listen to them, they change us. Yes, they're about change, first element of a successful story. But when they're good, when they're really good, they change us. Good stories compel people to change the way they feel, change the way they think, the way they act, behave. They change the way we see something. They provide insights, like I said. They shift our perspective.
Well, that's exactly how I feel about life stories. Biographies have probably been one of my favorite genres always, because there's just nothing like, more inspiring to me than reading how some person or a protagonist or hero wrestled with some great challenge and overcame it. And then, understanding how they navigated, their lives in the most kind of minute ways. It makes you realize it's never just one big thing, one giant dragon they're slaying. It's a number of little things. But speaking of big giant monsters, going back to Jaws, I loved something that you said in one of your research papers. You kind of talked a little bit about, Brody, but then also Jaws, as both of them in a way were protagonists. Can you talk about these stories that are kind of complex, where there's it's not just a villain, but you might also they could be both and.
Right. Yeah, no, absolutely. And, I think Jaws is a great example, to illustrate the other two elements that, change, conflict, right, is right. The first element that we would see in good stories. And then I said tension and involvement or engagement, right? And I think Jaws is a great example for those of, I always tell my students that, it has become sort of a cult movie nowadays. But when I find a student that hasn't watched Jaws, I said, like, sorry, you go back to your dorm, watch Jaws, and then you come back. I don't want to give any spoilers. But yeah, no. So what do we see in Jaws, right? That's master storytelling at its best, right? Let's talk about the first element that we just talked about in terms of Jaws: change, conflict. What's the change? Chief Brody moves from a crime-ridden, I think it was Brooklyn or something. I don't remember right now at the time. But he moves from NYC, right, from New York City. It's kind of crime-ridden, whatever. And he moved to this little town. I think it's all well understood that it's Amityville. Amityville, but it's Martha's Vineyard. All of us know that it's Martha's Vineyard, right? So he moved to this quiet town. There's no crime and whatever. And then all of a sudden, left and right. Well, no, not left and right, but first it starts with a boy, right? Not a boy, but a young man that appears killed or half eaten by something. We don't know what it is, right? At the shores of the town, right? That's changed right there, right? That changes Brody. That impacts Brody, and he has to look for what's causing this, etc., and whatever. And this is the interesting thing that you were saying about the shark, right? Jaws. We don't get to actually see the shark until the last third of the movie. We all, after the first killing, we see left and right, a boy, this, and another killing. But we never see the shark. We hear the music, which is terrifying to this day of my life, right?
It is.
dun, 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 and just became, this, you knew that the shark was
Oh,
coming.
totally.
You would see pieces of it, but you would not see the shark. You would see it under the third of the movie, this last third of the movie. That creates tension, right? Tension, the second element, is created by raising the stakes for the protagonist. So Chief Brody is like, what's happening here? It's another body and another body and another body. And then music combines with this, intrigue. And then the fact that we cannot see the actual animal, right? Or the shark and whatever, that builds tension, right? That's what prompts the audience to say, why is this happening? Or, sort of what Robert McKee, a great screenwriter, calls the violation of expectations. The audience expects something and boom, it doesn't happen, right? So it prompts the audience to start asking questions like, will she save the world? Will he recover his wealth? Will Chief Brody, get rid of this, assassin, right?
Yeah, it's extremely effective. And I actually saw in some documentary that the shark broke for a while, which is the only reason they came up with that device. It's kind of like, wow, where would we be in cinematic history if that hadn't happened? And it's
Right.
storytelling, because it's still the perfect example of these concepts. Love it.
And finally, the third, and we'll stick with Jaws, right? The third element, involvement or engagement. So here's the thing. All stories are about change, and you raise the stakes by, creating tension, but none of those two things would matter if we are not engaged with the story or the characters. Involvement or engagement hinges on emotion.
And this is what makes it such an effective mode of.
That's right. That's the magic of story, right? In order to generate emotions in a story, good storytellers are very successful at building empathy between the audience and the story's characters.
Well, it's excellent that you're explaining it in this way, because I mean, so many of us are kind of stuck in that conflict we have today of like between the rational and the irrational. And those of us who work in the creative field, it's difficult to explain exactly how they complement one another, as you said. So, I mean, really, when you start taking about this out of the context of the arts and into marketing, something as essential to business as marketing, it's even more interesting. I'd love to know how all of this translates into a brand example.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that I always say to companies that I advise on these matters, or to my students actually too, is that most companies make the mistake of thinking that the store, when they say, oh yeah, we want to apply storytelling to our company, and they immediately think of that tab in their websites that is called Our Story or History, right? And they go on, it's like, yeah, we were founded by blah, 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 and then we've grown this and that and whatever. And I don't want to say that that tab is not important, right? Like that tab is important. We need to know, and we care about where companies come from and, their ethos and et cetera. But if you really want to strategically build and craft stories or storytelling into your strategy, you really need to think your focus of attention, and you need to think about your customer or your potential customer as the protagonist of your stories to build empathy. Because a customer, if they're looking at your collateral, if they're looking at your ads at your website, at your print ads, or whatever collateral in a podcast or whatever you're putting out there, they are not going to identify with a company that has grown for the past 2 years or 5 years or 20 years or 200 years. They're going to identify with the common mortals that look like them, that have the same problems and tribulations as them. And they're like, yes, they understand me, because they're portraying somebody with the same problems that I have. Going back just quickly to Chief Brody, why do we empathize with Chief Brody so much? Because at the end of the day, we understand, at the end of the movie at least, we understand that the movie's not about a shark. that the movie's not about, bodies being, left and right on a shore. It's about Chief Brody's self-confidence. He is afraid of the water. And the last line of the movie is Chief Brody, after they kill the sharks, like, he tells a very young, Richard Dreyfuss, can you believe I was afraid of the water? This is the big moral of the story. Is like, if you really work for it, you will conquer your fears, right? And so again, when we as consumers see ourselves reflected in characters, in stories that brands portray, in which they portray consumers like us, we immediately make that link. And then we're hooked, right? And then we see how the company helps, empowers the customer to save, the world, right? In this case, the world is to solve their solution, to satisfy the need that they have. So, and now with the advancement of technology, we can do this transmedia, right? So it's not, we were used to do stories as, only with books, right? But no, we can do that in many platforms. We can tell many different stories that all supplement the big lesson, right? The big, idea that the brand, espouses, right? Which is be creative, like Apple, for example. There's no borders or boundaries for you. Be creative, and you can do whatever you want with our products. And they show you from different perspectives: the creative, the artist, the writer, the architect, the designer, all these different things. And we can do this in what experts are now calling transmedia storytelling. But I'm going to show you two examples of two brands. These are print ads. And the beauty of this is just in one print ad, they are really showing how storytelling works. Let me share my screen. I have a few examples here that I wanted to show your audience. So this one is Patek Philippe. Patek Philippe is, a high-end maker of watches, and they've run these ads forever. I mean, they're not rookies. They've been doing storytelling for, a long time. What you see, right? We see a picture. You see 2 or 3 generations in a picture. You see the product, and then you see the copy, and the copy tells the story. You never actually own a Patek Philippe. You merely look after it for the next generation. Picture, copy, brand.
It's so deceptively simple but so elegant. And I love this, of course, because the connotation around passing things on to the next generation is exactly what our company is about. Excellent.
It's on point, right? And again, this one research topic that I focus a lot on is digital storytelling, which basically is how can we tell stories using 3 layers, verbal or text, visuals, and audio, right? Like in this case, we have 2 combinations, right? 2 layers, visual and text, right? And that's all they need. Corona is another good example, right? Particularly of exploiting moments that people can connect with each other, no matter what culture, religion, et cetera, you're from, as long as drinking is okay, right, in your culture, et cetera. You have moments for relaxation, moments of turning off your devices and just be in, your zone. Log off, lime in, find your beach. And so, and that slogan, find your beach, has become the slogan per se to put everyone that sees an ad from Corona in this mindset of, oh, okay, time to relax. Corona, therefore, the brand becomes the example for moments that we like to share with ourselves, that we like to share with our buddies, with our family, in total relaxation, being ourselves, find your beach, right? And again, picture, copy, brand, and sometimes not even using the Find Your Beach slogan, you know, but maybe adapting it from where you'd rather be. And you have people, a cooler, a sunset, and they're telling you a story that you have lived, that most of us have lived when we go on vacation, when we are in a relaxing time. And they've been using these images, and then they superpose them with a couch in an apartment in, you know, you could see the skyline in the back of the apartment. And they're saying, this, you're with your Corona, this is your beach, right? This is how you get transported. So there's a concept in storytelling called narrative transportation. And this is a concept in psychology that explains this effect that when we are really, really immersed in stories, you know how somebody could, you know, tap you on your shoulder, you're reading a book or watching a movie and you're like, you startle me, right? Because you're immersed in the story, right? Whatever the book you're reading, that's called narrative transportation. And that narrative transportation effect hinges on another effect that is the mirror effect. And is when we identify with the characters, with the images that we're looking in front of us, right?
Well, I'm definitely immersed in this Corona ad. It's definitely
well, it calls you, right? You're there.
Absolutely. And I mean, with such small amounts of copy and just hugely powerful images, it tells a beautiful story without, you know, with hardly any words. I love how you're showing this. This is great.
So those are, you know, two examples that I, you know, kind of wanted to show, you know, your audience about, you know, the power of storytelling. There are other examples. Airbnb is doing it all the time. Stories from hosts or from guests, and you can read them, how that, you know, apartment they rented in Seville, Spain, you know, really was something, and they write their stories.
Yeah, I found that testimonials are, I mean, one of the most effective forms of communicating a brand's value.
Because you empathize with the person who's writing, right? Yeah, one of my projects right now is I want to test online reviews, two different types of online reviews. One online review in which you have the typical, you know, facts. Oh, I don't know, the earphones are great because the volume is higher than my old earphones, and you know, the sign is great and blah blah blah. Versus another one that tells a story about how the noise reduction canceling feature, you know, almost, you know, they couldn't hear what other people right next to them were listening to or whatnot, whatever, right? Story versus facts. Facts tell, stories sell.
Oh, perfect. Yeah, I mean, features are one thing, but people's experience of those features, you know, is so much more powerful. So, I mean, we know you teach a whole course on brand storytelling. This is so great. We have a couple more questions, but I have to ask, are you putting together like a book or anything that we can access later?
So I'm planning on writing a book about these things. Not at the moment, like I said, because I'm busy with other projects that I need to put out there at this time of my career. But yeah, no, it is a dream of mine to put together a book with all these perspectives. There are some books, very good books out there already. Yeah, I want to do something more interdisciplinary, not something that is, something that is based and rooted in marketing and branding, but something that brings together from different other perspectives, like literary criticism, you know, literature, movies, audiovisual, communications, and things like that. But yeah, you'll have to wait a few years.
Well, I hope you'll do that because we have to get out of our silos. I mean, so much of what you're telling me is so relevant to my field, and yet because it's called marketing and not communication, which is what I studied, I didn't get access to that whole realm of thinking. And so many other people who studied and everything else, other forms of business, they often, you know, they just don't know how nuanced your field, I mean, this particular discipline, even of storytelling, can be. So it's incredible how many people need to learn what you've just shared. I'm really curious also to get into, before we go, your access, sort of exposure to so many different cultures. I mean, you were born in Monterrey, Mexico, taught in schools in Spain, and you just told me about your trip to Japan. how do all these cultural kind of different perspectives factor into good storytelling?
Yeah, yeah, no, thank you for asking that, because it definitely has influenced a lot of what I do. When you asked me earlier, how storytelling came about, and I share that childhood memory of being in a theater club. Honestly, how that was connected later on when I was doing, my doctoral dissertation in Spain, and I was interviewing. My dissertation had was about how home ownership represents different parts of our identities. How becoming a homeowner, you're expressing different elements of your identity. And what I wanted was to interview Spaniards, right? Like people who were born and raised in Spain. But at that time, Spain had a big wave of immigration. So I also wanted to interview immigrants who had been living there for 10 years, et cetera, and that recently have become homeowners. And so I wanted to hear those perspectives. And like I said earlier, I was fascinated by the similarity of stories that I was hearing from both sides, right? No matter where they were from. My own experience traveling and working with other cultures. Most of my research is cross-cultural, and I've spent the past 6-7 years every summer in Japan and in China. And most of the stuff that I publish already compares American young consumers with Chinese and Japanese. I was on my sabbatical this semester, and I was supposed to travel, but COVID happened, and I had to stay here, right? But I'm collecting data from Spain, Mexico, China, Japan, and America for a project that has to do with stories and the way that people understand stories culturally. So I've, on my own experience, I've discovered that stories unite us, but also that there are different features or arcs or characters or whatever of stories that are very culturally specific. You mentioned religion earlier, and that is true. It's something that we observe in the research. The late Barbara Stern, she was the pioneer in consumer research and applying literary criticism, or lit crit, we call it, to consumer research. She said, once stories are a cultural staple, since they are universally engaged by all communities in the world, right? But we also have to admit that stories are cultural artifacts, and they're reflective of the context in which they're created, right, and told. So stories echo very idiosyncratic, very specific understandings of life and society that are prevalent in cultural context, right? And ultimately, our culture provides the preferred narrative forms, right, and arcs out of what we make meaning, right? Because the stories are about making meaning out of our lives, right, and experiences. Like I said, research has found stark differences in the way people tell stories about themselves or their loved ones, depending on whether they're from collective societies or more collectivistic societies or more individualistic type of societies. The ones coming from collectivistic societies, usually found in Latin America or East Asia, they tend to emphasize interdependence, right, with other family members or even with the society as a whole. Whereas those originating from more individualistic types of societies tend to be more self-focused and based on the independence and uniqueness of characters. Other research has found collectivistic societies, for example, rely more on telling past stories, like based on historical events, to talk about lessons learned, whereas individualistic societies tend to rely more on stories that maybe are one-time events and focus on the protagonist emotions and the role that those protagonists have in these events.
Well, you're certainly kind of helping me understand my own trajectory, because being from a very individualistic society, America and Texas on top of that, when I had, my awakening around sustainability, which was my career, as you know, before I started in preservation and storytelling,
Yeah.
it was as if I woke up from the story that everything was just about me, my needs, what I want right now, and comfort, and realize that was just part of the story of humanity. And it's kind of like this whole story of interdependence had been kind of like behind the veil, and motherhood just kind of cracked that open, and it's it was pretty profound. And so to realize how many of us operate in this story. And then we have politics that just reinforces that and doesn't enable people to wake up, but rather stay entrenched in that one interpretation. It's pretty powerful what you could do out there in the world, or any of us, if we learn how to discern what's a story that we should continue as like a universal truth versus just a thing we'd like to tell ourselves and believe to make ourselves feel better.
Absolutely. And, it's very powerful what you just shared about how, you were in this mindset and then something kind of cracked it open and make you, think, to the point that we were making in our discussion earlier about how stories can change
Yeah.
you in the way you see things. So I bet that if you go back and, when all started for you, when sustainability, et cetera, resonated, you can go back and think about that moment of change. That's something I always tell my students when they're trying to craft their own stories and they make them compelling. I always say, can you go back and think about when things change for you? And then if you find the moment, imagine that you can see that moment in a picture on your iPhone, and then you do a zoom, like take me back to that moment, right? So I bet that you can go back and think about that moment in which things click for you and change. And then if you zoom in, you will find a very interesting story to share.
Yeah, I've actually shared it a lot. It was August 2005. So, I mean, we can get into that later, but interestingly, when that story kind of pierced my bubble and I started to wake up and realize, oh, interdependence and loss of species. One thing I was doing with my young kids at the time, because I just had my baby, but then as they grew up, we started reading more about animals, and we learned that sharks, going back to Jaws of all things, were being lost by millions, and something like 173 million sharks were being lost from the ocean, each year. Something just staggering due to shark finning. And we ended up kind of creating a grassroots movement and starting with the Humane Society. And we got a law passed in Texas to protect the sharks. The Humane Society did that, but we started this grassroots campaign as a family. So again, just these stories that you think, oh, it's something to just say that a story changes you, but it changed me. I mean, that's not even an overstatement. And so I love that message of yours, Mario. Thank you. Tell us the future of brand storytelling for you. What are you doing next?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, and a difficult one, because it's about kind of anticipating what's coming. One thing for certain that I can see coming is interactivity, right? I think stories will evolve. When I look at, or when I think about the research I've done, and like I said, all the way from cave paintings to screens in a smartphone or multiple screens, and then how we tend to interact with content very differently than 20 years ago even. Now we can be watching Jaws and then tweeting about Jaws, and then looking at a website that has all these maybe satellite stories that spin-offs that emerge from Jaws, and maybe there's a TV show that builds on the movie, So again, this idea of interaction with different media, I can only see that interaction going forward. And then if you think about the technology like VR, virtual reality, right, artificial intelligence, right, how all those things are going to come into play to maybe even not have one story that is fed to a bunch of people or an audience, but that every single one of us may be able to live a kind of a unique story in that framework of story. So something like, I remember when I was a kid, books of choose your own adventure, right?
Yeah,
Something like that. Right, but in a more, you know, in day and age technology, where we'll be able to interact with virtual reality, when, you know, depending on the choices we make, artificial intelligence will be able to guide us, and knowing our preferences, guide us to, you know, here and there, and things like that. So that's what I envision for the future of storytelling in general. For the future of brand storytelling, I would say the same thing, right? Like, brands need to interact a little bit more with customers if they want to empathize more and more with them. I think the most important, you know, thing to remember for brands in terms of storytelling is that there's another element. This is important. This is not like a key element for good storytelling, but something as a side effect of good stories. Every good story needs to be shared, right? Like, I mean, otherwise we don't tell stories. Like, we tell stories because we want to share them. And this goes to your business, right? Mm-hmm. If you don't share a story, then it's advice, you know, that is not taken by anyone, right? And so we need to understand that stories are all about sharing them. And so, to the extent that we make stories of our brands that resonate to different audiences, no matter their generation, where they come from, we make sure that these generations, again, no matter how young and how old they are, they will keep passing on these stories. And if these stories are linked to your brand, then you make sure that your brand stays alive.
Well, I couldn't agree more. I mean, establishing a heritage that people want to keep passing on absolutely works, and brands as well as families and companies. So it's really exciting to see how all this comes together. And I'm just so grateful that you shared your knowledge today and your story. Thank you so much, Mario.
Thank you for having me. Really a pleasure.
Well, we'll keep up the conversation. You have a fantastic day.
Let me know. All right. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.